Hello and welcome to the History of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now in today's video, I want to tackle a very important topic for the church, and that is the cases of divorce and domestic violence. Now, when it comes to domestic violence, historically the Lutheran Church has actually permitted divorce in cases of domestic violence. Now, in the scriptures, Jesus says in the Gospels that the only reason for divorce is adultery. And then St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 says that in a situation where a non-Christian spouse deserts their partner, that the Christian is allowed to get remarried. Now with the Corinthians case, that's not necessarily the person deserts you and then you get to go and get a divorce. The actual word used in Corinthians is if the person separates. It's the same word Jesus uses in the Gospels to rent a marriage asunder. So it's more if the one party divorces the other party, the party who is deserted is free to go and get remarried. So generally the scriptures give two reasons essentially for divorce. The prime reason given by Jesus is adultery, and then St. Paul gives this additional reason of desertion. And historically, Lutherans have also added in the situation of domestic violence, normally putting it under the category of desertion. One of the prime examples of this is the Lutheran theologian Johann Gerhard, who in his aphorisms, when he talks about marriage, line 65 says, violence is likened to desertion. However, I think this statement requires a bit of unpacking to actually understand what is going on here and why Lutherans have permitted divorce in cases of domestic violence, and why Lutherans don't permit divorces in, say, other cases. See, one problem is that there are some Lutherans who mistakenly think that desertion should be interpreted in such a broad way that it just means whenever somebody is failing in their marital duties, therefore divorce is okay. But that's a very broad and subjective definition. Because if it's just failing in your duties, well, if a wife isn't being submissive enough, a husband could divorce her. If a husband isn't providing enough money for the wife, then she could just divorce him. So it does become kind of more vague and arbitrary. So when you establish that more broad definition on desertion, it really opens the gate to a lot of other things for divorce. But that's not what I think Gerhard is getting at. And to understand what Gerhard means here is we actually have to look at the aphorisms themselves. Because if we go up further, in aphorism 56 on marriage, Gerhard says, matrimony is dissolved by death or by adultery. He then says that by adultery, the very bonds of marriage is dissolved so that it is permissible for the innocent party to take vows a second time. Now, when we get to line 59, Gerhard says again, in the case of malicious desertion, if the deserter departs, the magistrate rightly advises the innocent party. But then Gerhard says in line 60, at the same time, however, the exclusive declaration of Christ does not permit a cause of divorce other than adultery. So when Gerhard is talking about violence, domestic violence being equal or likened to desertion, we need to actually understand what he means when he talks about desertion being a cause for divorce. Because what Gerhard actually says is that the Bible is clear that the only reason to get a divorce is adultery. Desertion is not necessarily a reason to get a divorce. However, this is where I want to bring up the situation of emergencies and pastoral care. Desertion is not a reason to get a divorce, but that divorce may be necessary in the case of desertion. And that here, Paul is applying pastoral care in a difficult situation. Because what Paul is talking about is when he does talk about desertion, he's talking about a situation where there is a Christian who's married to a non-Christian spouse. So Paul first says, look, if you're a Christian and you are the deserter, then you have the command of God to return to your spouse. But in a situation where the Christian is the innocent party being deserted and the deserter is an unbeliever, then they don't have any command of God to go back to their spouse because they don't believe in God. Paul coming to an unbelieving deserter and saying, you need to return to your spouse, they're going to reject what Paul says. They'll say, what authority do you have? I don't believe in God. I don't believe in God's law. I can do whatever I want. So when it comes to the situation of desertion, it's not that Paul is saying, oh, here is a situation where divorce is now permissible. What he's saying is, in this difficult situation where this situation may occur, my pastoral advice is that the innocent party is free to go and get remarried. And so this is reinforced by what Gerhard says when he says, look, in the case of malicious desertion, the innocent party can go and get remarried. However, we need to specify that the only reason to get a divorce is in the case of adultery. Desertion is not a reason to get a divorce. It's that divorce is allowed in a situation of desertion. And so when Gerhard says that domestic violence is likened to desertion, he's not saying that domestic violence is a reason to get a divorce. What he's saying is that in this difficult circumstance, we would allow a person to get divorced and be remarried. We're using some pastoral care and advice here in this difficult circumstance. And this is here where I want to talk about an actual situation that Martin Luther dealt with regards to domestic violence and how Luther dealt with it. And particularly, I want to talk about the doctrine of emergency. And for those who haven't seen my video on the doctrine of emergency, I talked about how Jesus in the Gospels established that in cases of emergency, when a person's life is in danger, the ordinances of God can be broken. And so, this, I believe, is the principle that Martin Luther uses when he does advise a woman to get a divorce in the situation of domestic violence, because her life is in danger. And therefore, it is a case of emergency that we can forego the ordinance of God and permit a divorce in this circumstance. So I just want to look and read from this particular circumstance that happened with Martin Luther. So around the year of 1524, Martin Luther was the pastor at Wittenberg, and he wrote to the court official George Spelton regarding the situation of domestic violence. In this letter, Luther writes to Spelton saying, "The case of marriage involves the following. I, Martin Luther, along with the pastor and the secular judge, that's believed that the pastor there is Johannes Bugenhagen and the judge is the Sheriff Valentine Froster." Luther writes that these three men have heard of the case between Michael Hank and his wife. At last, Michael has been convicted by 8 witnesses, men strong in faith and responsible, that the wife now for many years has been in continuous mortal danger while in his power. He hits her so hard and is so violent and attacks her so often with a drawn sword that it is thought that he is insane. He does not even give her nourishment. Indeed, whatever is in the home he takes with him and he spends it. Luther then goes on that he requests that the magistrate and them would permit a divorce in this circumstance. Now, here we can see that Luther is referring to a case of domestic violence. And what does Luther say is the reason for why this woman should be permitted a divorce in this circumstance? Because her life is in continuous mortal danger. That's the situation Luther is referring to. Luther's not talking about some circumstance where maybe a husband and a wife got in a spat, and in this one time in their entire marriage, maybe the husband slapped his wife on the cheek. That's not what Luther's talking about. Luther is talking about a situation in which a man is so violent against this woman that her life is in danger. Not only is he beating her severely, he's threatening to kill her with a sword. And that he isn't even feeding her. Doesn't necessarily say, but we could assume that he's possibly a drunk. Because Luther's saying that he is taking all the money from the household, and rather than buying groceries with it, he's going and spending it, assumably on alcohol. Maybe something else, but that is an assumption I'm making. The point that Luther is making is that, yes, divorce is a sin, and that the ordinance of God is normally that you should not get a divorce unless there is a case of adultery. But in this case, this here is now a case of an emergency in which the woman's life is in danger. And Jesus in the Gospels establishes the rule that when someone's life is in danger, the ordinances of God can be overlooked. Particularly in the Gospels, Jesus says that in cases of a matter of life and death, we can break the Sabbath. That we don't have to obey the ordinance of the Sabbath. If Jesus was saying that the Jews didn't have to obey the ordinance of the Sabbath if someone's life was in danger. So too, Luther is saying that since this woman's life is in danger, she isn't needing to obey the ordinance of marriage. Yes, in ordinary circumstances, a person should not get a divorce unless adultery has been committed. As Gerhard taught in his aphorisms, the only reason given by Jesus in the scriptures to permit a divorce is adultery. That is in keeping with the ordinances of God. But as St. Paul teaches, in emergency circumstances like desertion, or as Gerhard would teach, in emergency circumstances like domestic violence, we have to forgo the ordinance of God for the sake of the individual. As Luther teaches, in this situation where a woman's life is in mortal danger, we have to forgo the ordinary ordinances of God and allow for divorce in this circumstance, because if we didn't, she would probably die. Luther himself talks about how the magistrates didn't want to permit a divorce. Instead, the local magistrates of the Wittenberg Council wanted to simply have Michael Hack and his wife separate for a period of time and then have the wife return to her husband. Where Luther says they wish to send her back to her death. So you see here that Luther's reasoning for allowing divorce in a case of domestic violence is because the person's life is in danger. There is a similar circumstance that C.W.F. Walther dealt with in his days, where there was a woman over in Germany who was being beaten by her husband so badly she was being knocked unconscious. And so Walther permitted her to get a divorce and then helped for her and her children to immigrate to America so that they would be safe from this man. And so when it comes to situations of divorce and domestic violence, and saying that domestic violence is likened to the situation of desertion, we're not saying that desertion is this somehow broad topic that encompasses any time there is some kind of disunity in the marriage. No. What we are saying is that in the cases of desertion and domestic violence, these are emergency circumstances that go outside the ordinary, and so we need to apply some kind of pastoral care in these extraordinary circumstances. And particularly in the cases of domestic violence, both Martin Luther and Walther established this rule that when the person's life is in danger, then divorce is permissible. And so we need to keep in mind that Jesus says that the only reason to get a divorce is in cases of adultery. But when there are emergency circumstances, we can forego the ordinary ordinances and institutions of God. For the sake of preserving life, we can break the rules of God here. And that is a rule that is established by Jesus himself. When life is in danger, we can forego the ordinances of God. And so when a person's life is in danger, we can forego the law of God that divorce is a sin. And so in cases of domestic violence, divorce is permissible. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.